This is our first meeting, so we're going to do things a little bit differently. Our speaker, Stephen Flipse, will present as normal, and we'll have a discussion both on what he presents and also on the paper that we've distributed. Our first meeting, so we're going to do, and then if there's time, we will then have a second presentation from Stephen. Based on, he's going to update the work that he did and talk about some of the activities at Delft that are built around stir and midstream modulation. So let me, without further ado, just give a quick little intro to the seminar series. And first, welcome everybody. Thank you for registering and attending. As you know, my name is Eric Fisher, and I'm pleased to present the seminar series with my main co-organizers, Marika Smolka, Cynthia Pickering, and Lyric Pete. And we are also joined by a number of co-organizers from around the International STIR Network, several of whom are participating here today. I won't go through their names, but they're listed prominently on our seminar series website. And I did want to acknowledge that the series is hosted by Arizona State University's Center for Responsible Innovation, supported by the European Association for Study of Science and Technology, and also supported by Maastricht University. So the purpose of the seminar is really just to provide opportunities to learn about STIR and basically to grow the STIR community worldwide. So the main format is that people who have experience studying and deploying STIR and analyzing the results will be presenting their work, and participants then can discuss this based on prior circulated papers. So most of you know what STIR is, but in case you need a reminder or are new to the STIR world, STIR is a qualitative mixed method form of research that combines observation, participant observation, collaborative interactive dialogue, as well as intervention-oriented interactions. And the intervention part of STIR is a little bit controversial and nuanced. A lot of people think that STIR is intended to come in and change things intentionally. We actually try very hard not to do that, but at the same time, we know that STIR will most likely have an effect, and so we try to use that effect as a source of understanding. So the three objectives of STIR are to understand experts' capacities to be reflexively aware and responsive to societal concerns and considerations while they're going about their normal work. And the second objective is to explore how these capacities could be deployed differently, how robust they are, and possibly how much more robust they could be if the conditions were changed. And finally, very carefully, we do seek to exercise and to enhance and deepen these capacities. But this is where the nuance is involved, because we go to great pains as STIR researchers and practitioners not to infringe upon or unduly influence the moral agency of our participants. So to do STIR, there are three main components that are used in order to collaboratively describe expert decision situations in real time while experts go about their normal work. And these three components are what we call the decision protocol, an ethos of engagement, sometimes called the embedded humanist. These are a series of techniques and practices that are designed to make sure that we don't unduly influence the moral agency of our practitioners, so that we can study the capacity rather than change the capacity from the outside. And finally, the analytical framework known as midstream modulation. STIR has been practiced and deployed and tested in over 70 organizations around the world. These are largely academic organizations, and then also private sector, both small startups and small and medium enterprises, as well as some policy and civil society organizations. And it's been deployed in about 20 countries worldwide on 4 continents. And our series this year will feature 12 such studies, and they are taken from a range of studies, some of which were conducted back in 2006, and the most recent one in 2020. So most of the studies have published their work. A few of them we will circulate pre-publication papers for you to read. And this month, January, our very first speaker, we're going to be focusing on a paper that was published in 2012 by none other than Professor Stephen Flipse. Stephen is an assistant professor of communication design for innovation at Delft University of Technology. And Stephen is very active in a number of different projects and activities, many of which are built around responsible innovation. And I noticed on his website that one of the things he does in his research is he explores the actual practical opportunities, sense and nonsense of responsible innovation in relation to innovation work. So I like this no nonsense approach to sense and nonsense. But it's wonderful to have Stephen here, and also Don Schubiers in attendance, because as some of you might know, Stephen is actually a 2nd generation STIR practitioner, because he was trained primarily by Don Schubiers, who's a 1st generation STIR practitioner who was trained by me. And Stephen has gone on to train many other people in STIR and midstream modulation, including Robert Pronk, who will be presenting in the seminar series a little bit later this year as a 3rd generation STIR practitioner. So without further ado, I want to introduce Stephen, thank him for joining us, and invite him to give us his presentation on midstream modulation of biotechnology, redefining the researcher's role.
Cool, thanks, Eric. So I guess that sort of makes you my grandfather, right?
Something like that.
Yeah. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but yeah, it could be worse, I guess. All right, so in all fairness, I thought it was fun to say a thing or two, of course, about this study that was published in 2013 about midstream modulation in a biotechnology corporation in the Netherlands. But when I was preparing this presentation, I found out that the actual work for this project was carried out in 2009, and that makes it sort of 13 years old. Yeah, while that is of course okay, things were sort of, yeah, they moved to the background of my mind a little bit. So I had to dig very deep to really figure out what it is that we actually did at that time. And yeah, I hope you can forgive me if I don't fully recall the order of events. And I think it cannot be worse than some politicians who cannot even figure out what they did last week. So I think we should be okay. So what I'll be talking about, this midstream modulation in biotech thing, which was actually carried out at a life sciences firm called DSM in the Netherlands. And I also wanted to say a thing or two about what happened afterwards. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about this study. So just a nice picture of the Delft University of Technology on a nice sunny day, which is very, very near to the offices where I was to actually carry out some of this work. So my actual work office was only like 150 meters away from here. Which provided a nice view of the campus for a little bit of inspiration. But in any case, yeah, to say a thing or two, the Delft University of Technology is not primarily a university that was historically very interested in socio-technical integration research or things on the more social side of engineering, because classically it's actually a very technical oriented university. And people were a little bit surprised that these types of studies are actually also being carried out at this university. And I think what has happened over the last 13 years is that people got more enthusiastic about these kinds of approaches. So you see that slowly but surely in different departments, there seems to be more room for, I think transdisciplinary science or transdisciplinary learning, which then after this study, and after I got a position at this university just as a staff researcher, has more or less picked up speed. So people are more enthusiastic, and it sort of paves the road for more research into this area. So I'm optimistic, but we cannot forget about where that more or less started about 13 years ago. And yeah, so therefore I'm talking a little bit more about this this paper. I don't know how we want to do this. If there are like questions in the meantime, that those can be asked or not, or that we should wait until the very end. And I'm looking at Marijke, Erik, and Cynthia.
Yeah, we'll probably wait for questions at the very end unless there's something burning that must come up. But otherwise, we'll just listen to you talk, Steven, and then open up the floor.
Yeah, and feel free to put a question in chat as well, if as you think of it, and then we can kind of go through those at the end.
Fair enough. All right. So essentially, I have four perspectives that I want to cover in this short presentation. The first is about access to the lab, then about the things that we actually did in the industrial lab, and then talk a little bit more about the outcomes and what happens afterwards. And what's maybe fun to highlight here is that this was one of the first studies, and perhaps the first study, to do stir or midstream modulation in an industrial context. And it happened more or less simultaneously or very shortly after Daan's study that you're going to hear more of in the next session. So yeah, all these things happen more or less close together in time. And it happened under the under the umbrella of a larger public-private partnership. So there was a formal collaboration in place between various universities and big corporates in the Netherlands and outside of it. And under that bigger umbrella, there was a little bit of room for these kinds of studies, under which Daan's and mine also partly took place. That means that we were maybe lucky that there were some internal advocates. There were some people within that larger public-private partnership that saw some value in these kinds of things, and also said, we're organizing this social research parallel to all the natural scientific life sciences oriented research. So yeah, why not play along in that sense? So we were lucky in the sense that people were I'm not really sure actually if they were enthusiastic or if they were ambivalent, in the sense that let's see what happens, we'll give these guys a try and then see what happens, or that they were like, it has to happen since they got money anyway. But in any case, under these circumstances, we did find a couple people that were really enthusiastic about the approach, and these were more senior people, more in business than in the university, that really found some value in enriching the technological decision-making process with socioeconomic and socio-ethical considerations. So there were people, and in my experience, funnily more from business than from the university, who said, it actually makes sense if we have our scientists, our life scientists, think a little bit more thoroughly about the socio-ethical context of our work. And also for that, in all fairness, I'm not particularly sure why they were so enthusiastic about that. If they were enthusiastic because they just felt that this should happen, or that they found out through their years of experience in this technical field that, yeah, this is something that still needs to be developed because of, well, instrumental or functional reasons. Well, in any case, we found some of these enthusiasts, and a couple of them were located at this life sciences company called DSM, also located in Delft in the Netherlands. And a couple of these people we found willing to enter into conversation with us, but only after we drafted a 1A4 paper with what we actually wanted to do. I opened that letter just last week in preparation of this presentation. And these are the words that we used in that letter: socio-scientific research project, insight into knowledge production systems, demands for laboratories to engage in responsible innovation, investigate how interdisciplinary collaborations assist in enhancing awareness of external socioeconomic demands. And if I look back at it now, I'm more or less surprised that this high-level engineer within DSM actually found this engaging in some sort of way, considering the high level of social scientific language that we actually used in this letter. Nevertheless, either he was flabbergasted and thought, I want to know more, or he was like, yeah, okay, we'll give it a try, because this seems like a decent guy coming from a technical university, so how bad can it actually be? Well, after getting that access, yeah, we actually thought something like, oh yeah, crap, now it actually has to happen. Now we have to actually do something. And of course we had a plan for it, but it was not fully designed yet at that time. And that's the moment that I sat together with Dan and with Eric to figure out, what should we do here? And we got access ultimately to this one project that had 4 project associated scientists and 1 project leader. And the scientists were all post PhD level, so they were hired after their PhDs by DSM to work on, wet laboratory research in the life sciences. So the whole purpose of the project was to develop some sort of biochemical that could be used in for example, bioplastics. And they were eager to sort of develop this as a product. And at the same time, we then had these. These sort of technical requirements, in the sense that they had to do this technical work, and I could feel. Oh, sorry, I think there's someone that we're gonna mute. Are you guys hearing that too?
I think they've muted their microphone. It's good. You can continue.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I could feel this continuous pressure of, okay, we can do these kinds of things, but we still have to perform. We still need to earn our paycheck. And in the first meetings that we had, this actually played a role. And I'm going to tell a little bit more about that in a second. But in that negotiation process, we actually got to a situation where we were allowed access, because it was quite formal actually. And it was quite formal because of worries about ownership of technical data. So people were a little bit worried that I was going to perhaps, I don't know, steal their scientific ideas and sell them to the biggest competitor. I'm not really sure. But some contracts were signed for that. And then we came up with this setup. You get 12 weeks, you get 3 months to basically do an intake interview and an evaluation interview afterwards. And then in the meantime, 1.5 hours with every participant based on whatever strategy you want to employ for talking to these people. Now, as time progressed, they were a little bit more enthusiastic than we anticipated. So there was also a review meeting. with the project leader and the participants. And then there was also a bigger presentation at a larger conference and a couple more talks to business development managers. And basically it got bigger as we actually were doing the work within that organization. Now, what did that questionnaire look like and what did the outcome look like? That's in the paper. I want to focus a little bit more on this decision protocol. And yeah, you might recognize it from earlier STIR or midstream modulation related papers, but essentially it revolves around this concept that you explore decisions that are made on the laboratory floor from 4 different perspectives, being what is it that you actually want to reach with these kinds of things? Why do you want to do these kinds of things? What kind of considerations play a role in that? Could you perhaps do it differently? How do you think the outcomes will change if you do it slightly differently? So constantly navigating back and forth between opportunities, considerations, alternatives, and outcomes. Now, one of the things that people found interesting within the organization is that they said, you know, our decision-making process within this company is primarily based on technical and economic things. So can we make money out of this? How much effort is it going to take us to actually reach the research outcomes that we want to reach? And can it actually be done? So technical and economic things. Whereas initially I had the idea that STIR would focus mainly on technical and social elements. So I had the first idea to just do these kinds of protocol-based discussions on technical and social elements, but immediately from the very start, it became obvious that I could not forget about these economic elements. And from a STIR perspective, that meant adding an explicit economic framework to technical and social considerations that had not earlier been done yet. Now, you might recognize here in this picture the stream metaphor, so research goals, research processes, and research outcomes. And it turns out that as we were talking, we were not just talking about, you know, opportunities, considerations, alternatives, and outcomes, but we were talking about opportunities, considerations, alternatives, and outcomes on 3 different levels. There were levels that were that had to do with, you know, what kind of research can we actually do, or should we actually do, or what kind of activity should we embark on? Then there were decisions that had to do with, you know, how can we actually manage this particular process? And there were decisions that had to do with how to organize, frame, and use the outcomes of such research. So if you think about it, the decision protocol discussions were not just on the midstream. So in hindsight, I'm wondering, was it just midstream modulation that we did, or was it also upstream and downstream? Well, in any case, I think I came to the conclusion that this midstream influences what kind of research is going to be carried out so much that it's really hard to find sort of a hard border between midstream and upstream. It sort of flows back and forth and is directly associated with one another. So whereas in theory, we're always very eager to say, you know, there are upstream decisions, midstream decisions, and downstream decisions. In practice, I very quickly learned that this is not necessarily the case, because considerations and alternatives are also about upstream and midstream, or upstream and downstream considerations, and not just about things that are ongoing at the laboratory floor. Now, then, as sort of a next step, I found that it's not just about the decisions that you can analyze using this decision protocol, but these decisions are especially interesting for the people working there at this company, the moment that you actually found conflicts of values, for example, value conflicts. And I found that they were continuously asking themselves the question, what are we actually doing here? What is our purpose as scientists within this corporate firm? Because on the one side, we're trained as academic scientists, purely interested by curiosity and finding out how the world works. But ultimately, yeah, we realized that this corporation also needs to make money. So how far can we actually go there in on one side, exploring our passion for science, but on the other side, thinking about the strategic goals for the company. And that was regarding the kind of research that had to be carried out, but it was also relevant for how that research was actually carried out, because there were decisions on who to actually include, who to share data with, who to involve in decision-making processes and data analysis, for example, and this revolved particularly also around the public-private partnership that that this company was participating in, because on the one side you had this sensation, this is our company and our funding, and we need to make money out of this. But at the same time, they're participating in research for a sort of wider social good, and you could really see that that led to a lot of conflict in the minds of these people. And there's a continuous back and forth between social considerations on the levels of participation and collaboration, but also on a bigger societal level. And perhaps Dan next time is going to say a bit more about first or second order reflections that may to some extent also play a role here. And then there's this continuous back and forth between scientific, economic, and technical considerations. Now, what did that lead to ultimately? We found a number of decisions that were social, technical, and economic in nature. And if we plot that more or less for those 5 participants in the course of those 3 months in this sort of upstream, midstream, downstream map, we can see here that there's a number of economic decisions that are directly business relevant. There's a slightly larger number of technological decisions, like how should we carry out this kind of research. But the predominant color here in this scheme is the social elements. So it turns out that the decisions that they were making, where they actually felt these kinds of conflicts and where they said, this is actually worthwhile that we think about it a little bit more thoroughly, had actually primarily or predominantly, I should say, to do with the social system within which that research was actually carried out. So yeah, that was also, well, I wouldn't say surprising per se, but we made this promise beforehand that we were going to look at the way in which technical decisions were made. Well, it turns out the technical decisions are important, but perhaps more important was the way in which research was carried out and who was actually involved with that particular process. Now, in that paper that was distributed earlier, there's a couple of examples. Yeah, if you look back at that 13 years later, I'm thinking, was it really that big? Was it really a sort of life-changing experience, a life-changing difference in strategy that really occurred? And in all fairness, I cannot really claim that. Nevertheless, it's a lot of small decisions that ultimately determine the course of such a project. And if you have 5 people who now do their work slightly differently, yeah, that is perhaps a larger influence than the actual influence on individual decisions that are made by these researchers in these contexts. Now, the whole identification of de facto, reflective, and deliberate modulations was one thing, but perhaps more interestingly, we also asked this question, how do you see this? Is this extra on top of your work, or is it part of it? And yeah, the fun thing there was that everyone was more or less open, but considered it extra at the beginning. And after, they actually said, no, everyone should do this. And I have these quotes here that demonstrate that they were positive. But in the follow-up talks that we had, and the reflection meetings afterwards, they were even more enthusiastic and said, maybe we should create a position within our project teams for people like this. Where I say, well, then it's not really an external partner anymore. So the question is how useful that actually is. But in any case, it was good to see that they were at least open to this idea. So yeah, in sort of summary then for the feedback that we got, they said, yeah, it's very functional, it's very useful. And next to that, it's also interesting, nice and fun to do. We could really show some learning effects, and this change from being extra to being part of your work. Yeah, that is what surprised us perhaps the most, and hence that also made it to the title of this paper, as it is currently available. Now, then a couple of more personal reflections as a last slide here. Did it help that actually I wasn't trained as a philosopher or a social scientist at first, but I was actually trained as an engineer with a big interest in socio-ethical and socio-political context of research? Well, perhaps it made it easier to understand the technological dilemmas that these guys are working with in engineering practice in industry. Yeah, perhaps it did to some extent help. Does it mean it's a prerequisite for those engaging in these types of research? No, I guess not, because there's also ample of examples of functional midstream modulation or stir studies without that person having a background in engineering. But I personally found that it actually supported conversations, not necessarily the small talk. So there is value, of course, in just welcome to the lab and getting a short introduction and these kinds of things. That happens to all embedded ethicists or social scientists working in labs. But it's about when it actually goes into the details that perhaps more easily they found, oh yeah, this guy understands what we're going through. And I think personally it did help me to understand those dilemmas more quickly. Which is to some extent perhaps a good thing. I'm not really sure. Yeah, so did it help that I could relate it to research and innovation more easily than to just socio-ethical context about research, that I was not a social scientist or an advocate for the social sciences or an advocate for, I don't know, social justice and deliberative democracy in industrial innovation practice. I think it did help that I did not have a political agenda there. Nevertheless, then if you sort of look at what role I actually got within the organization, I did afterwards wonder, did I enable reflection, or did I enable them to do something better? And was I, in fact, an instrument of industrial innovation? And that's something that I'm still puzzling around a little bit more. So am I this instrument of reflection, or this instrument of higher quality, more thoroughly thought out innovation? And by extension, should we do these kinds of things? And that's another dilemma question that we've been pondering as STIR scholars, I imagine. Should we perhaps have a more political agenda regarding, for example, responsible research and innovation? Well, that remains to be discussed, I imagine, and I would propose that we leave it at that for my talking. So thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Steven. And I really appreciate your points along the way. And I would like to invite the members of the audience to just raise your hand. Maybe that's the easiest thing to do. And I'll call on you. You can also put your comments in the chat and we'll get to those. So Puga, welcome. And you have the floor to ask the first question. So I think Christian Puga Gonzalez can maybe hear us or not. I know that he was coming in and out during the session. So Puga, if you can hear us, jump in at any time. Meanwhile, perhaps we should move to,
Okay.
yeah, Puga, can you hear us?
Me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
welcome
Sorry.
from Mexico. Go ahead and ask your first question.
Yes, I'm here from the third world, so you can expect that connection. Yeah, no, I'm at a coffee shop and internet comes on and off, so that's why I was having trouble, and there's a lot of noise, so I'm going to be as quick as possible. So Stephen, you talked about how you think you might have influenced upstream decisions or downstream decisions. I am here interested in how much do you think the scientists and engineers that you were working with were free to take the decisions they wanted, and how much they were constrained by either their PIs or the company they were working for, and how much do you think that funding specifically influences if you had any results regarding this? How much do you think that funding influences the degree of freedom that scientists and engineers had in making the decisions you were attempting them to make them reflect on?
Yeah. So thanks, Chris. Nice to see you again, or hear you in any case. So two different things. How free were they to take the decisions that they wanted to take? And then specifically, to what extent did money play a role in that? And that freedom was, to some extent, very limited. So they had to convince all the time that a research step that they had to take was worth the effort. Everything needs to be signed off on in this company in any case, and the PIs did have the liberty to some extent to say, you know, this kind of research is actually necessary that we do. But yeah, you can imagine that if you do some sort of big fermentation experiment that's going to take a couple days, that needs constant sampling, that needs to be checked by some technician, it's quite expensive. So research steps to be taken are easily what was it, 5,000 or 6,000 euros or up for doing these kinds of things. So yeah, if you order 30 of those research steps, then it's already a lot of money. So they are perhaps more than in academic labs aware of the actual costs of the research that they do, and yeah, they do actively take that into consideration. Now, on the other side, there is they do get the sort of authority to do this kind of research because people feel that there is a profit to be made ultimately. So on the other side, they're also quite free to say, you know, if we don't do this, then we're not sure that it will actually work. And all this investment that you have invested so far is, well, for nothing, right? So they are aware of the tensions, and they're aware of this balance and the responsibility that they have in this balancing act. And after a couple of years also studying scientists in universities, I think they were more aware than academic scientists of on this particular element. Does that help, Chris?
Yes, thank you. The reason I am asking this is because, yes, as you mentioned, you compared academic labs with research for whatever other purposes, I mean, commercial purposes. And the reason I am asking this is because I have found that more and more, the more I go and steer, where do funding come from influences a lot how first of all, how free are scientists and engineers to take decisions, and then what kind of decisions they are allowed to take. Does that make sense? One is how much they can, in what space they can move, and how much they can move in a particular space. And I just wanted to know how much you found about that. But yeah, that it totally makes sense. Thank you, Stephen.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. All right.
Yeah, great question, Puga. Thank you, and really nice answer, Stephen. Which of course raises, two questions in my mind. One is, what are the limits of midstream modulation? In a sense, the technique, the process, the approach was designed to go into situations where decision making is highly limited and highly constrained, and to ask, yes, okay, we know this, but is there still some agency, social or human, and does that matter? But also, I think the discussion between Puga and Stephen raises the question of, would it be interesting to sort of categorize different degrees of freedom, that some researchers have more freedom, some have less, or they have different varieties, and does that also affect how the STIR approach influences? Let's now go to the next hand raised, and then we'll look at some of the chat. But I see that Sina has raised a hand, and we will invite Sina to ask her question.
Hi, yes, my name is Senna. I've previously done some work on gene editing in livestock. And I'm really wondering, in that project, I also collaborated with an ethicist. But here I hear the word social and ethical being used more or less interchangeably. Is that done deliberately? Or did you approach these two parts differently? Because I find it now a bit confusing for me, but and also I had another question. You say you look especially at decision-making processes, but did you also look into, did you give them like assignments? Okay, go talk to 5 of your neighbors or about the technology that you are developing, and how would this then land in society? Or, did you also do that type of work? Yeah, I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So maybe regarding that first thing, that I use social, ethical interchangeably. Yeah, perhaps that is the case. And I'm not particularly careful in my choice of words, perhaps. Nevertheless, just yeah, the questions regarding what is right and wrong are usually very much associated with social or societal impacts. So that leads me to some sort of degree of freedom that I'm giving myself to actually use these kinds of words. And also, I didn't want to be too strict on it when talking to these scientists, because ultimately they just don't care. As long as you can make it relevant for them, then it is justified, I guess, to some extent. Nevertheless, in my papers, I try to be a little bit more careful. So thanks for that. Regarding the extra assignments, yeah, in fact, we did do a couple of these things, but in all fairness, it was not so sensitive. So they did not do gene editing in livestock. It was a yeast-based fermentation. So I would not say that it is so socially dangerous or awkward that these kinds of considerations played a role there. And I think the whole gene editing debate for yeast and stuff is more or less over, unless you try to apply it to food ingredients. But even there, yeah, people seem to care less and less, is my impression, as more pressing issues seem to be higher on the political agenda these days. But that's my interpretation, and we should perhaps ask other people to reflect on that particular thing as well.
I'll just chime in before you answer Senna's second question, because I frequently use the phrase socioethical as a hyphenated entity, and I do it quite intentionally because the general approach, and I think others like Don and Marika can chime in too, but I think we very intentionally approach ethical issues, as Stephen was saying, as part of the social context, whether it's a personal moral commitment or a code of ethics or a particular virtue ethical stance that is shared by a culture. We don't necessarily adopt these as separately from the social context. So there are interest groups, there are biases, there are commitments and whatnot, but we don't want to exclude the ethical either and just say social. So that's why Stephen has inherited this socio-ethical jargon. But your second question, Senna, is very interesting. Did you give them assignments, Stephen? And if so, why? And if not, why?
No, I didn't. I didn't give them formal assignments that they had to complete, but in those discussions using the decision protocol, elements like, you know, what would you actually say to people if you were to disseminate this information to a wider audience, do play a role, of course. So it's not that you're actually getting into role plays, but the content is covered.
Great. Let's move on to a question in the chat that comes from Dror. And Dora asks, did you see impacts of this work increasing profit rather than it will work or it will not work? And is there a case where you can link a business outcome to this way of working? So did this have
good question, and not in this paper. It was in a follow-up study where we actually linked STIR to more business relevant decisions and more business relevant outcomes. And there people actually claimed that the research process was increasing in efficiency. And while we did not do an actual economic study of these kinds of things, there was evidence that some research steps that were initially planned to be taken were actually, based on these discussions, canceled, thereby saving the organization a lot of money and directing that money into, that was what was at that time more functional research. So we did save a lot of money for that particular organization. But when I say a lot, I think it was in the order of 25 to 50,000 euros of research that was initially planned that was now rescheduled. Now, can you immediately say that you saved an organization a lot of money or that you increased profit? No, not per se, because they work with budgets. So they just know, you know, I have an annual budget for my lab for 250,000 euros. And the fact that you're changing a research step does not increase or decrease that amount of money spent. So they're still going to spend 250,000 euros if their budget is 250,000 euros. But it was more functionally spent, perhaps. But that has more to do with the way industrial innovation is organized than with the fact that, well, no money was actually saved. People just, you know, saving like 5,000 or 6,000 euros, they don't care. On an annual budget of the entire organization of what is it, 25.5 million euros for a small department there, they don't care. So
very good, very good. Puga, did you have another question? I see that the your hand is up, and I'm not sure if that's from the first question or if you've got a follow-up question.
That's just from the first question.
Oh, okay. So maybe we just. Yeah, so Drora has actually a follow-up question that the impact of your use of STIR is focused on clarifying the purpose that the researchers have. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, part of it, but I think the bigger effect was on just the learning process of these individual researchers. So the fact that they now had this capability of a more thorough reflective investigation, that was considered, I think, a more important added value after we actually did this study.
Great. Antonia has asked a question in the chat that you mentioned, Steven, that the participants received a benefit from the embedding of social and ethical issues. Could you please elaborate on this? Because in our work, often this is the main barrier. In other words, not having any benefit that is perceived by the participants is a barrier, if I understand correctly. So could you elaborate how the benefit was experienced, how you knew that, maybe why you think the benefit occurred in the first place?
Yeah, I want to maybe explore this a little bit further. Antonia writes, could you please elaborate on this? Because in our work, it is often seen as the main barrier. What is the main barrier? That you're not promising this, or that you're not reaching it, or that people don't believe that you can actually deliver it?
Hello, I'm Antonia and I'm from Technology Research and Innovation. So yeah, our problem is that when we start working with participants, often they don't see the benefit from the beginning. And they see this rather as a burden. And if I understood it correctly, in your introduction, you said that your participants, but I understand that it could be a cultural thing, because in the Netherlands, you have it much more natural from the beginning that social and ethical issues are part of everyone's work. So do they have this perception from the beginning, or this belief? Or you see it rather as a result? Because often when we invite participants for such things, I mean, we are new to STIR, but we have done lots of related activities. Often we are rejected because people don't see it as necessary, and they see it as even the contrary, like counterproductive, and you know, extra burden, extra work. So this was actually my question. In your case, do you see it as a starting point, or rather as a consequence? Yeah,
thanks. Good question, and sorry to hear that it seems to be a barrier for some of the research that you're trying to get off the ground there. Yeah, I think what helped here is that we had these believers on board. We had these sort of advocates of this kind of idea, and it didn't cost any money. It just cost them a little bit of time. And yeah, in all fairness, we were a little bit careful in making too much of a promise. So we didn't dare to make this big, you know, what is it, human resource relevant argument, like we're going to make your researchers better, or this is a learning trajectory and people are going to pick up on a lot of skills. We did not do that. We really brought this as a research project independently, and as a study of how things might progress, not making any content-based promises. So we also did not say you're going to make more money, or productivity is going to increase. And I also don't think, if I think about it, that should be the right starting point for these kinds of studies. Because what happens if we do that? What happens if we say, you know, we are social scientists or embedded humanists, and we're gonna support your practice, or make your work more effective or efficient, or we're gonna earn you so and so much money? Then there's going to be all these expectations that sort of also put pressure on our yeah, to what extent you can speak of neutrality as researchers or objectivity as researchers. Nevertheless, you're still struggling with this question, you know, how do you get access to these kinds of places? And yeah, I'm not really sure how to tackle that for you, but perhaps other people have a good idea on that. People with similar situations were at that time able to persuade people to open up. I don't know.
I'll just jump in just to say that STIR was actually designed for situations not only where there's highly constrained decision making, but that there's also a neutral or even a skeptical attitude towards socio-ethical reflection during technical work. And so it's sort of part of the program not to make such promises, but to, and one of the strategies that we've used that's been very effective is to appeal to the experimental and skeptical side of scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, and say, well, look, you're under pressure, whether it's by funding agencies or clients or consumers or markets or publics or whatnot. You're under pressure to sort of take these things into account, responsible AI being the present, one of the present examples. But of course, we don't know how much you can actually do this and whether, even if you can do it, how much profit it's going to cost you. So let's find out in your situation. So this is a wonderful technique that I've sort of passed along to my students, because it frees you from making any promises or telling any stories that you can't fulfill. But it also provides an opening and an invitation that is appealing to somebody's skepticism. It says, bring your skepticism, we want to work with it. But I don't know, others might have a response to that. And unless anyone wants to jump in, then I think then we would go to Marika. But Claire, did you have an instant response to that question, or should we hear from you after Marika?
I have an instant response, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. I was just wondering whether this appealing to the skeptical side, is there any degree of skepticism on your side as researchers doing this kind of research? Because I've been following you guys for a long time, and my impression, if I can be so bold as to say it here in this forum, is that you were more normatively inclined 10 or 15 years ago. So Eric, when you introduced this session, you said that you don't want to undo the moral agency of targeted researchers, and you don't want to influence capacity per se. But at some point and it could be a kind of lack of understanding on my part, I understood STIR as actually wanting to influence capacity and wanted to influence kind of framework conditions as they are. So I'm just curious as to whether all of your experience now has led you to reflect and reformulate your ambitions.
It's a great question, Claire. I think that I have become more nuanced over time in my language, but I don't think there's been a fundamental shift. There's been some experiments. I think I had some colleagues that were saying, Eric, STIR really is going to be so great for advancing sustainability goals. This was even before the SDGs were formulated. And so I started to develop this line. Okay, what if we use STIR to actually try to advance these specific cultural, social, political, ethical norms? But very quickly, both myself and my students said, whoa, Eric, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? STIR is this wonderful, right? What makes STIR unique is that it doesn't try to advocate for a position or advance something. And so that's what led me to develop this idea of STIR 1.0 versus STIR 2.0, which we don't really talk about very much in public because it gets very complicated. But to come back to what I put up in my slide, one of the third goal or objective of STIR really is to enhance capacity. However, it's not to direct the capacity, right? So we want to encourage more reflection during research. And we hope that there will be more deliberation during research, that there will be an increase in value sensitivity. But whether the researchers decide, well, this was great, but I'm not going to use any of it because I can't afford to, that's their decision. We don't want to then have them make certain actions or commitments. So I hope that answers your question, Claire. I think there has been consistency, but it's a very difficult stance. So the normative commitment of STIR is for reflection, deliberation, sensitivity, a broad capacity to receive and sense, values, latent values. And sometimes this is sensed with the mind, sometimes it's sensed with the body. And so Marika has done a lot of work on affective work. And Lyric actually in the chat asked about whether disconcertment was part of something that came up in Staven's work. So this is a development where we again are looking at the capacity for, entrenched technical experts in modern society to pick up on signals around them or within them that they might otherwise not. This is what I think we normatively are committing to enhancing, but we don't promise that this will advance certain SDGs or it will advance social justice. But let's pivot to Marika now, because she's had her hand up for a while and she may want to speak to this or introduce a new topic.
Yeah, I actually have a different question because I think you already answered the question on value sensitivity versus value advocacy, how I think about it quite extensively. My question goes more into the methodology in terms of what you did in the lab, because you said you were present, you had lots of talks with the researchers, Stephen, but that actually everything that happened in between the STEER exercises was not taken into account in the analysis. And I was wondering, if you actually only looked at the exercises, how could you be sure, or how could you at least correlate or relate the exercises to the actual outcomes? So for instance, you describe how there was a conference talk organized or changed, and this was related to the exercises. And I think if all these contextual information that you gather as a field worker, an ethnographer, in addition to the exercise, if that's not taken into account, then it's very difficult to be sure that it's actually the exercise that has this influence rather than, I don't know, an ethics course. I'm just saying that because in my case, I know the researchers I worked with, they also went through an ethics course. So I needed to know that in order to say, okay, partly they might have changed their conceptions of ethics because of our exercises, but it might also have been the course, and we talked about that. So I wonder how you handled that issue in terms of, the complexity of factors that could have led to modulations. Thanks.
Yeah, good point, good question. And I think indeed you're right. You're never fully aware in the course of a 3-month period of what is happening in people's personal lives or in their professional lives. I know at least for these people, they were not in any courses because that I did ask at some point. And I only used the data in the papers that I actually got from recorded interviews. So if they said something, just while walking somewhere in a hallway, it was not part of what I actually presented. And I guess if you would include all the differences in thoughts and sort of reflections that also occurred during, I don't know, an occasional lunch meeting or a Friday afternoon drink, then you might even get more of these reflections being observed. And I don't know what they were talking about, of course, after that first week during their Friday afternoon drinks when they got together. They're like, oh yeah, there's this guy, Stephen, what did you talk about? I don't know what happened, but I can't say. The question is it important? Because even if something did happen between them that I was not a part of, it did happen at the end of that week because we actually did those kinds of activities. And if they then reported on it in the interviews, then it's still a result of the intervention, I guess, unless you have a completely different opinion on that. But I think in summary, you try to stick to what you can social scientifically soundly prove. I don't want to say too much about things that are speculative also in the paper.
Go ahead, Marika, if you had a follow-up. I'll just say for clarity, I think when you're talking about proving things scientifically, you mean that since you hadn't gathered this evidence systematically and analyzed it, you can't really comment on its content. Right.
Yep.
But we should be clear that STIR exists in this world. It's a mixed method approach. So there is a quantitative element in the pre and the post comparisons, and also in the participants and the controls, which Steven didn't have any controls in this study, but he did in his second study. So these are attempts to sort of be quasi-experimental and to have a little more positivist, reductionist scientific rigor. But nevertheless, the whole thing exists very much in the world of qualitative research. And I think in the end, we have to remember that and say that we're making not claims of causality, but we're looking at correlation. And one of the techniques we use to strengthen the correlative judgments are having triangulation, multiple streams of data. So not just gathering data from your participants and what they say, but also watching them and observing them, what they do, and then watching them in group settings and actually interviewing or gathering data from what others might be saying or doing, and maybe looking at documents that the group produces. So if you're able to get data from 3 different sources, then you can triangulate and say, yes, this is a correlative change, and it's correlated to the STIR interactions. Right, then I think this is as rigorous as anybody can get in this world. But that maybe leads us a little bit, into sort of general STIR methodology as opposed to Steven's particular study. Well, at this point, maybe there would be a natural break, so we could go into some of the other questions in the chat, or we could invite Steven to just give us a short presentation on some of the work that he's done since 2009, since this was published. I'm getting 2 thumbs up. So why don't we invite Steven to give sort of part 2 of his presentation and to give us a view of what he's been doing since.
Well, really briefly then, because I also noticed that we're running out of time slowly but surely. So what did we do afterwards? It's maybe nice to just illustrate that, there were a couple of papers afterwards where we tried to link midstream modulation to different kinds of fields, and maybe clockwise from the bottom left here. This first study that I wanted to comment on is that we aligned key performance indicators in industry with STIR. So we tried to see if there were business relevant criteria for the quality of innovation projects that were or were not improved measurably or quantitatively accessibly in industry. And we could actually prove that there. So there was a stronger case for the value of socio-technical integration research in practice. And what's maybe interesting to see is that where there we could actually prove these kinds of things, in a more recent study where we linked specific responsible innovation criteria to business criteria, this link was less predominantly present. So in a follow-up study regarding specific responsible innovation elements, we could not make that link so explicit. So it's fun to see that there's some sort of difference between socio-technical integration research on the level of individuals and research and innovation and particular responsible research and innovation perspectives in industry on a more corporate level. So that makes me think, at least, that an individual approach is more useful than an institutional approach, or at least that's my hypothesis at this time. Now, then there were a couple of studies where we also tried to do midstream modulation in industry, one of which was also published in the Journal of Responsible Innovation, particularly on brownfield technology development. And what was fun to see there is that rather than in a course of 3 months, we could actually do this in the course of 1 month. So a more compressed learning endeavor to also still demonstrate that there was some deliberative modulation going on, some deliberate changes in practice based on discussions with an embedded ethicist. Now, later, we also tried to see, you know, perhaps relating to some extent to Claire's question earlier, I think for me, just through experience and time, I got more aware of the possible value or the possible impact that STIR could have on practice. So where first, perhaps I was a little bit naive or something in just saying, you know, maybe it has an effect, maybe it hasn't, and I'm not really going to concern myself with it. The moment you figure out that you actually have an effect and you have an impact, and I became sort of aware that that impact could be steered as well. Yeah, you have to be a little bit more careful. And then we try to figure, you know, are there areas where we can actually functionally deploy this outside of the field of innovation where it's perhaps somewhat sensitive? And we figured that education would be a nice field, considering that I'm in this group called Science Education and Communication. And we tried to use midstream modulation for starting teachers to help them gain a couple tips and tricks. So by becoming embedded in their first year as teachers, as an external party, using the decision protocol for a couple months with these new teachers, you could actually see a learning effect there as well. So this was one example of where we actually had a functional, to some extent, normatively inspired, deliberate action use of midstream modulation in a practice where, well, it was considered less socioethically sensitive, perhaps. Yeah, next to that, we developed a couple guideline papers also, Eric and I together, which are maybe nice to see. And then at some point we figured, can we also turn it around? Can we do midstream modulation, but then we as social scientists being stirred by a natural scientist? So I had a couple of research projects with students going on, where I said, you know, you're the social scientists, develop something, do your social scientific work, but the engineers, the technologists are gonna stir you using the decision protocol. And what was fun to see there is that I don't think it was stir anymore, but it got sort of the shape of a co-design process or a living lab or an academic living lab, as you sometimes see, in which you have a sort of broad disciplinarity or wide disciplinarity or perhaps even transdisciplinarity. But I completely lost track of the fact that it could still be called stir, and I wasn't convinced of it anymore. So the thing is, if you turn it around and you have natural scientists work with us, if I may say us, it gets to be something completely different. And it took me a while to realize that apparently this only works in one direction, or it works also in another direction, but then it's not stir anymore, I imagine. Which was just one of my further considerations that I thought would be nice to perhaps kickstart a future discussion on the future of stir and whatever it is that might evolve into. All right, so that was it. I promised short, and I think I held up to that promise, right?
I think you delivered, Steven. Thank you. Well, we still have 15 minutes, and I see that Peter has asked a question and also a previous question we didn't get to, and then we'll go to Petra. So Peter asks just now, how open are teachers, particularly chemistry teachers, to learning in your experience? I'm sure that's not tongue-in-cheek. And then also he has an earlier question. Could you specify the kinds of impulses that your presence and style of inserting yourself and your questions had for the participants?
Yeah. So perhaps that first question, and then first, how open were chemistry teachers to learning? That was a problem for more experienced, seasoned chemistry teachers, much more than for the young ones. So if I may say this, the older they got, the less prone they were to participating in these kinds of things, and the less effect it actually had in practice. But for a couple of these young ones, I think there were 5 or something involved in the program. They were very eager to actually start because they seem to be aware of the fact that in your first year, you have to take care of the didactics, the teaching process, as well as the content, and master this whole process of administration behind running a classroom. So they actually appreciated the feedback of someone commenting on this. So I hope that answers that particular question. And then when it comes to my impulses, presence, and style, yeah, of course, you cannot deny that the individual approach and atmosphere you create around these kinds of things very much has the potential to determine the outcome of these kinds of engagement activities. Yeah. And that begs the question, can anyone do it? And I don't really know. I'm also not sure if I'm the right person to answer that particular question. I just know that I personally enjoyed it very much, and I came to enjoy it more and more as those 3 months progress.
I'll just jump in Peter, did you have a follow-up?
Just for clarification, maybe I meant actually 2 things. It's nice that you point at the style part of the question. Maybe important here is I guess you need to be a person who is socially quite intelligent to adapt to various situations. Not everybody may be easy in speaking to people in their own contexts and adapt to their knowledge worlds and so and move around there and be a decent person all the time instead of doing the wrong things from time to time in a more or less unexcusable manner. So you need very, very sensitive to situation and social relations and stuff like that. So I guess this is a prerequisite in that respect. But I was also wondering whether you have a particular style compared to what you see other steerers do. And I also was interested in what kinds of, I didn't want to say impacts. I hate that word, and that's too, you can't count, but what sorts of influences can you kind of typify a little bit? What micro or bigger sorts of reactions you created? Have you ever collected a kind of spectrum of influences your presence had?
No, and I think if I would do it again now, 13 years later, I would be more aware of that. But I think, in all fairness, that 13 years ago, I was just not aware of this social dynamics and social complexity of relationship management. And I think I was to some extent lucky that I did not have the expectations of a professional, very senior consultant from a renowned firm who was coming to do these kinds of things. So the people had perhaps low expectations.
Fascinating topics, but let's go to Petra and then Sarah.
All right.
Okay. Yes, Stephen, I was triggered, I think, by your observation that when you compared sort of the individual versus the institutional aspects, you thought that, okay, STIR is probably more effective or something like that on the individual level. However, so for instance, I'm working in the realm of applied research, and most of our research is really, it's really done in team settings or teamwork. So my assumption or understanding is that you have been doing your interviews like in a one-on-one setting. And I was wondering, have you actually thought about or actually endeavored also interviews in group settings? If yes, how did it work? And if not, would it make any sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I think for this particular study, these people were 5 members of one team doing something, but I did not talk to them as a team. I talked to them as individuals. Would it have been possible to do this in smaller groups? I'm not particularly sure if that would actually be possible. Because group teaching activities, and I'm saying this as a more from a didactic background than from a STIR background, but group learning is just very different from individual learning. So you have things like group safety, a willingness to participate, willingness to share, that play a more dominant role in team learning approaches rather than in individual learning approaches, which you perhaps recognize as a scholar in this particular field. Is that relevant to what you were saying, Petra?
Sort of. Maybe I should rephrase. It's probably more. It's about sort of with the intent that sort of the influence rather than the impact, as you just heard, might be sort of maybe they could actually not necessarily learn together, but at least listen to each other and maybe take up or do something with it later on. So not necessarily replacing your individual interviews, but more or less sort of extending them or enriching them also with sort of the presence of the others while you're interviewing one. So rather than having all of them together in one interview, which is more like, yeah, which I would understand, it's just really having the others listen in or something like that, like more of an observation type.
Yeah, it would be interesting because also one of the critiques of STIR is that it's so small scale, and perhaps this is a method to actually expand also and make the impact more widely noticeable within an organization. So I would be open to setting up a study in that particular direction.
I'll jump in before we shift to Sarah because I have two quick comments. One is that I have on 3 separate occasions employed STIR to stir a group. And Stephen's right, there are very different dynamics. It is still possible, but there, I think even the objectives start to change. But then the other comment is that when I've done training sessions, I've had a STIR dyad, if you will, dialogue, and then the rest of the group watches. And Antonia and I have actually formalized with Petra this method into something we call STIR-RE, and we've piloted it twice where there is a STIR dialogue, but it takes place within a broader institutional organizational context. But since Petra is asking the question, I think she can also answer her own question, so I won't go into that more unless Antonia or Petra wanted to comment on that, then we go to Sarah.
Yeah, so this is really another sort of variety of what we have been doing in our context. It's really like the dyad more that you referred to, and which is different than really one-on-one interviewee situation, all the others sort of observing. So, but then again, yeah. Okay, but thanks a lot. Very inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Sarah, then?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I've got a quick question, and it might refer to most of you doing STIR, and it's about how nowadays with the responsible research and innovation framework, a lot of companies in the corporate domain, in biotechnology, where I work, do need that integrated social scientist. So it's not just us from academia saying, can we come and talk to you and enlighten you? We are being sought. And for example, within this, there's also the figure of the corporate ethnographer. And I wanted you to see if you have considered the overlap and how the dynamics and who is the starting kind of party, because then we often end up with this, oh, who's this useful for? Do they take you seriously? And if we only have to publish papers to read amongst ourselves, and what's the point as well? If we cannot create this change within the setting that we study, I mean, we can study it and change it as well, not just one or the other. So yeah, any comments on that? Thank you.
Yep. Actually, we've been thinking a lot about this, and I don't know, I've mixed feelings about it. If you ask me personally, right? On the one side, I'm a scholar of science and technology, in particular of responsible innovation in industrial science and engineering. So yeah, it's perhaps not very nice to say, but I don't really care about that. On the other side, it would be good if this develops as a professional profile, and how that then should develop as a professional profile maybe is a scholarly question that we should concern ourselves a little bit more with. So yeah, I want to talk more about that, but others might have an opinion on that is, well, equally or more valuable than mine.
Let's open up the floor to other responses to Sarah, because I think it's an important question. And one way to think about it is that it's going to happen regardless. So how can we, as sensitive scholars who understand particularly the drawbacks of institutionalizing STIR or similar approaches, how can we think about the corporatization and uptake of these things? And Don has made a comment that maybe it's more about change than impact. Well, okay, we'll hear from him next month on that. But do others have thoughts about how whether it's the corporate anthropologist or the ethics officer? Steven earlier mentioned that that his participants in his first study said, "Oh, let's make this permanent as an insider." And Steven said, "Well, what's the point? Then it won't be a critical outsider anymore." So I think it's a wonderful question that gets to the future of STIR and also the future of innovation. And we still have 2 minutes. So any further thoughts on that? Sarah's
Don
question.
can give a teaser for his next session.
Yeah. So Don's session is going to be next month, February 25th, 5:30 Central European Time, 9:30 Arizona time. And if he wants to give us a teaser, he can.
Well, not really. It's just that, you know, I left academia quite a few years ago, and I find I drifted away more and more of it because of, let's say, my own activist inclinations. So I love to be, you know, back here in this group and combine the two, you know, the desire to make a change and to have an impact. I think that many of us share, but also a little bit of the methodological rigor. So not so much a teaser for next month, but homework for myself. How do I kind of combine the two again? Also make sure it's a little bit rigorous, what I will tell you. But yeah, hope to see you next month.
Can you play a 30-second piece on the piano on the other side?
Oh, sure. Should we do that as the break? The intermezzo.
Yes, you can send us sailing into the rest of our Fridays with music. One quick announcement before we hear from Don doing his famous rendition of Pink Floyd or Jimi Hendrix, if he prefers, and that is that we, in between this first seminar and the second one in February, we're going to have a STIR practice lab. So if anybody wants to try out STIR or build their skills in doing STIR, it's February 10th. That's a Thursday. It's at the same time, 5:30 CET, 9:30 AZ. And you can find this on the website or email one of us, and you're welcome to come and build your skills or gain skills. But I really want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, Steven, for the great presentations, plural. And I hope to see you next time. And just all the best. All the best.
Thanks, Eric, also for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot.